Today is December 6th, and December 6th is actually the day when slavery was legally ended in the United States. December 6th, 1865, when the 13th Amendment was ratified by the state of Georgia. And in those 157 years, we've made progress, not always as fast or as thorough, but it's ironic today that in Georgia today, there's an election for the US Senate between two descendants of people who were enslaved back before the Civil War. So it's probably a nice coincidence today that we have Malcolm Johnston, whose great-grandfather, or great-great-grandfather was in the Navy off of Galveston for Juneteenth. So he's going to tell us more about that auspicious occasion.
Thank you. And if it's okay, I'd like to move the mic over side. There we go. And all of you, I'm sure, will be able to hear me with or without the microphone, but of course we do this for the recording that is taking place. I appreciate that you have invited me to be here, and many of you may have seen me give presentations before, and if you have, then you know that I'm less of a historian than I am a storyteller. And I try my best to be as accurate as possible as I tell the stories, but it's the stories that give history a little bit of life. And yes, I am the great-grandson of John Alexander Johnston, who was an officer in the Union Navy. And I actually have met a gentleman whose grandfather was fought in the Civil War. And so that generation, of course, is getting a little bit older, but it's just a wonder to me that we can go back that far with our generations. So I will go through a few hundred years of this issue of slavery in the United States, and would like to start with this handsome fellow. This is Admiral Sir William Penn. He was William Penn's father, and he created a navy for the then King of England, who would be King Charles II. And he not only created the navy, but he paid for the navy. And he simply told the king, when you get the money, you can pay me back. But King Charles never was able to pay back the debt that he owed to Sir William Penn. And that debt then reverted to who we know as William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania. This is William Penn at the age of 22. And one of my very favorite pictures, I particularly like the hairstyle, the curls that go along with that. And you can see that as a 22-year-old, he was in school and he was wearing a suit of armor here. And so it was thought that he would become part of the military family that had his father as admiral. But that did not happen because he became a Quaker. He joined the Society of Friends, and he believed in that everyone in the world should demand equality and should receive that from everyone else. All of God's men and women were created equal and should be given that respect. That really, really annoyed the king. The king, of course, is better than everybody else, and having equality of his subjects, that was absolutely unheard of. In fact, because William Penn preached equality as he did, he was oftentimes jailed for that, not for super long periods of time, but just long enough to get the message. Well, there came a time when William Penn and King Charles got to meet with each other, and they wanted to figure out what they could do that would be mutually beneficial. And sure enough, believe it or not, they were able to come very quickly to an agreement. As you can see in this picture, the king is being seated, and William Penn is giving his pitch, and the pitch was this: the New World had been discovered. It was under discovery now. And there was a huge chunk of land that nobody knew anything about in the New World across the Atlantic. But the king thought, well, what if I gave this big chunk of land to the Quakers, asked them to get on the boat and get over to this newfound land? That would solve two problems. He would trade the land for the debt, and he would get rid of a whole bunch of Quakers. So the king was all for that. And in a surprisingly short period of time, they were able to come up with the Charter of Pennsylvania in 1681. And it was soon after that that several Quakers, including William Penn, boarded the good ship Welcome and made their way to Pennsylvania to found the land of Goshen. And the first map looked like this. The Welsh tract that you see kind of a little bit on the upper part, that's where we are here. We're probably on the western edge of that. And then you can see that there is the Free Society of Trade. That was William Penn's land. He wanted to be a promoter of land. He thought he would make a fortune out of developing this the Free Society of Trade parcel, but instead he went bankrupt. So he was a great politician. He was not such a great businessman. Something radical happened. Skipping a couple of generations, as a matter of fact, to get to the point that there was slavery almost immediately in the colonies here. Mostly they went to the south. The slaves were being part of the development of plantations there, but there were slaves in the north as well, particularly in Pennsylvania. There was not too much discussion given to that. We're talking about families that had a small number of slaves and did not use them very much in agriculture. And these slaves were, the entire notion of slavery was set on its head when a slave ship called the Isabella arrived in Philadelphia in 1684. And this is a depiction of what that slave ship looked like. The slaves, of course, were in shackles. They were immediately taken to the town hall and they were sold as chattel. They were auctioned off. And there were Southerners who came up to buy slaves. There were Pennsylvania residents who also bought slaves. And the Quakers of the community were outraged that people, that human beings were being treated in this fashion. And it took them just a couple of years for them to come up with a position of being against slavery. Now, why was slavery so important? By the time we get to 1860, slavery was worth more as a capital asset than any other capital asset we can identify. In fact, the assets of slavery was worth 3 times more than every factory, railroad, and seaport in the country. So you can see the economic value that sadly was part of that particular aspect that we had here in the United States, or what would be the United States. The Quakers came up with their position at this particular home. It's still standing. It's in Germantown on Germantown Avenue. And there was a first formal protest against slavery. And it looked like this. If you visit the house, and it is open for tours, you can see an interpretive from, I believe, 1901 that tells that this was a place where the Quakers first made a position statement against slavery. But they had to sell it to all the Quakers, to all the meetings in all parts of the country. And it took them years to do that. Fortunately, there was a gentleman who was a champion, an anti-slavery champion, and he was by the name of Benjamin Lay. Benjamin Lay it looks like a caricature of this gentleman, but it's not. He stood about 4 feet tall. He had very skinny little legs and a very large head and a larger voice. He was a Quaker, and he was not shy about sharing his opinions about where their church, their meetings should go. And as a result, he was at times banned, told not to come to the meetings because they were tired of listening to him. But he did find a sympathetic ear, and that sympathetic ear was with Benjamin Franklin. And he was able to write a treatise against slavery, making all the arguments he could think of against slavery. And it was Benjamin Franklin who published it, even though Benjamin Franklin at that time was a slave owner. Well, things began to develop, and there began to be abolitionists who were getting together, and they began selling the idea that we don't need slaves. We can welcome the African American community. We simply can make them workers within our community. And this is one of the weird logos that they came up with. At the top, if you can see it on the screen, it says work and be happy, and it has presumably a Quaker talking to presumably a slave or soon to be former slave, still in shackles, but their lifestyle perhaps would not change quite so much, but it was a step in the right direction of how they felt with the African community. It was sort of like separate but equal was one way of being put it, that we could put it. That would come and go, as you know, for generations in our country. 1833 was a remarkable year for all kinds of reasons. We have first the British, who managed to figure out how to abolish slavery and create freedom for everybody. In 1833, they had the Slavery Abolition Act. And it didn't happen all overnight, but they had a plan that no longer would there be slaves within the British Empire. And in 1833, this gentleman created the American Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia. And he didn't know how that would go. Would it simply be a small group of people who were fervent, or would there be others who would join this? And indeed, it took off to the point where there were at times up to 200,000 members of the American Anti-Slavery Society. So this is one of the earliest of the abolitionist movements. One of my favorites is Gum Springs, Virginia. In 1833, that was founded by one person named West Ford. And he's a very interesting person. There was in the New Yorker magazine an article about West Ford. There's a contention that West Ford was the son of George Washington, and he was born to a slave. So here we have George Washington, West Ford. George Washington enslaved his own son, but he gave him privileges. And one of the privileges was that he could own land, which he purchased in Virginia, called it Gum Springs, just a few miles from Mount Vernon. And he set up a community for free slaves, among the first in America. We're still discussing whether or not this fellow is indeed the son of George Washington. My wife, Susan, and I got to go to Gum Springs, and we spoke with a person at their local historical society. And we got quite the earful on the heritage of both the community and the culture. He was an African-American individual, and it was a very enlightening period for both of us. West Ford was a successful businessman, whether or not he was actually the son, but he was treated quite nicely. In 1833, this fellow, William Everhart, built the Lincoln Building and opened it, and didn't wasn't called the Lincoln Building back in those days, but it was a grand building, a commercial building in downtown Westchester, where my office is now. I would welcome all of you to come the next time you're in Westchester, drop by the Lincoln Building. It's on Market Street, across the street from the courthouse. You can take a tour of the building. It doesn't cost anything. My office is downstairs. When I'm there, the door's always open, and it's become an interpretive for the Lincoln legacy here in Westchester. And this fellow, William Everhart, was indeed a champion of abolition. And he developed all of the property south of what is now the Lincoln Building. And he not only became the wealthiest man in Westchester, but he was wealthier than everybody else put together. And his favorite cause was abolition. The Lincoln Building was built by a fine Philadelphia architect named William Strickland. Feels like back in those days, everybody was named William. And they ended up, of course, with this structure. And I like this picture a lot because it demonstrates what it must have looked like in 1833. And the farm, the Wollerton farm that was purchased by William Everhart, became the backyard for this building, and of course eventually all of the development that happened in that part of town. 110 acres of development, as a matter of fact. And the other Presbyterian church, by the way, is part of that William Everhart. William Everhart was a Presbyterian. Just a little side note. And then there was this fellow that everyone had to contend with. This is, of course, James Buchanan. And James Buchanan served as president from 1857 to 1861, preceding Abraham Lincoln. And the Quakers were very, very interested in having a president that shared their beliefs, because James Buchanan was a favorite son of Pennsylvania. He lived in Lancaster. The leading Quakers of Westchester went out to Lancaster. It's one of my favorite stories. You probably have heard it before. But they go out to talk to this president-to-be, James Buchanan, see if they would give him support. And they had a number of questions that they shared with him. And believe it or not, he told them exactly what they wanted to hear. None of it was true. Can you imagine? From a presidential candidate, no less. He said he was going to solve the slavery problem. He said he thought that all people of color were equal to everyone else. None of that was true. Indeed, the ink on his inaugural address was barely dry before he had switched positions, had taken away citizenship from all African Americans, and had more or less entrenched slavery in the United States. Well, this fellow, who was one of the fellows who was looking for a good president and even gave his hand with James Buchanan, this is Joseph J. Lewis, and he was big-time abolitionist. And he thought, we need to get somebody in there that we can actually believe. And he worked with one of his friends, Jesse Fell, who had been born in Kenneman here in Chester County, went out to Illinois, made friends with Abraham Lincoln. And Jesse Fell told Joseph Lewis that Abraham Lincoln just might be the man that the new Republican Party can get behind. And he had heard a little bit about, Joseph Lewis had heard a little bit about this new person named Abraham Lincoln, didn't know very much about him, wanted some information, and Jesse Fell asked Abraham Lincoln to send autobiographical notes. And he wrote his first autobiography on only 3 sheets of paper, and you can see a facsimile of that at the Lincoln Building. But it is typical Abraham Lincoln. Not much of me, but then again, I'm just a regular guy like everybody else. You know, that's the way he talked. That's the way he wrote. Joseph Lewis read this autobiography and immediately thought, there's nothing to this guy. I mean, he did not talk about any of his politics, nothing like that. And fortunately, they had the telegraph, and so they could exchange questions. And eventually, the new Republican Party, being developed here in Chester County, would get behind this new candidate, Abraham Lincoln. And as you know, Abraham Lincoln needed to get his word out. And Joseph Jackson Lewis published the very first biography in the Chester County Times. And you're looking at the masthead right here, February 11th, 1860. And they shipped that up north to the northern states, New England and New York. And they managed to get that biography in front of people who really care or would care about Abraham Lincoln, because Lincoln had an agreement to visit New York for the first time in his life and to give a speech at a little church there in New York, a church that where the pastor was Henry Ward Beecher, who was an abolitionist. But when the newspaper arrived, it got reproduced, this biography, and soon there was an incredible excitement about Abraham Lincoln. They had to move this speech to Cooper Union. And here you can see a picture of Abraham Lincoln talking to a standing room only audience, and the cheers that began to grow from the audience with each phrase that Abraham Lincoln would give a period to. That inspired Lincoln to, maybe I will run for president. And sure enough, sometime during his presentation, in Lincoln's mind, I'm sure he thought, I could be president. And he began his campaign. We now know, of course, that the rest is history. He did become president. And this is what Abraham Lincoln looked like when he was at Cooper Union in New York. Lincoln could not pass a photo parlor without stepping inside and having his picture taken. Curiously, when this photograph was taken, it kind of sat in the archives. Lincoln never really actually purchased it. And it was more than a year before anybody ever saw it. But of course, by then he was president. So I'm not going to do too much of a deep dive. In fact, this is probably going to be the shortest little announcement of what happened during the entire Civil War, one of the bloodiest wars that we've ever fought. This, of course, is the Battle of Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, where the Confederates attacked the Union base. 4 very long years later, these two gentlemen, Ulysses S Grant, Robert E. Lee, get together and shake hands, and it's a surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, which began the end of the Civil War. If you remember your history in school, that was the end, but it wasn't. Only one army surrendered. There were still some even larger than the Army of Northern Virginia that did it. Now, one of the curiosities about Robert E. Lee, I bought a biography of Robert E. Lee, and right up front in the biography, it notes that he wrote his opinion about slavery, and his opinion was that it was immoral. He wanted it to go away. He didn't know how that would happen. Robert E. Lee, the master, most popular Confederate, if there is such a thing, he did not cherish slavery as one of the political stones of the Confederacy. Very interesting. Of course, there's Ulysses S. Grant, and he would become president. And I like to think that after the war, what we saw was 2 factions, our Southern friends and our Northern friends, who never really came to an agreement about anything, but they had to work together. And this picture of an American flag, a Union flag rather, and a Confederate flag, so close together. A nice visual of what our country looked like in 1865. So going to 1865, let's go to the Union Navy, and it was my great-grandfather who was in the Union Navy. He was born in Balmerino, Scotland in 1835. He was part of a shipper's family, had gone across the Atlantic several times. He knew Philadelphia quite well. And in 1860, he was the first in his family to ask for American citizenship. And he became an American citizen just before the war erupted. When the war was declared, Lincoln put out notice that they wanted to build an Navy. I think there were maybe 27 ships, most of them in Europe. And he wanted a fleet of 600 ships. And so there was a high demand for skilled sailors. And my great grandfather, John Alexander Johnston was his name, he joined. And he went through all the training and he became a young officer in the Union Navy. And fortunately, he had this gentleman that he was working with, Gideon Wells, Secretary of the Navy. And the curious thing about Gideon Wells is that, yes, he needed to have sailors. And he didn't care where the sailors came from. He had his naval base just south of Washington, D.C., right across the river from a whole bunch of plantations. And so he put out a word that any black man who crosses the river into this his naval base would be given immediate Union citizenship. They would be given a job, paid the same as their white compatriots, and would have all the rights of any other slavery. He provided, as far as I can tell, the first official emancipation, and he did it illegal. He didn't tell anybody what he was doing, emancipating, that would have been a wrong thing. He needed those sailors and basically became the first for the emancipation in 1861. And he created a navy that would be have some 6,000 sailors that looked like this. And it was pretty good life. 20 to 30% of each ship, 20 to 30% of their crew would be African American. And on my great-grandfather's ship, he actually commanded 3, but on the final ship, I can tell you for a fact, the crew was not segregated, it was integrated. On a small ship, you needed to have integrations. This is what an integrated ship looks like. African-American sailors and white sailors standing shoulder to shoulder, and that's the way it was. A lot of bodies on a pretty small vessel. There was segregation, but segregation was between the officers and the sailors. And so my great-grandfather, and I'm going to go back just a few here. I like to think that, I don't have a picture of him, otherwise I would show it. But I like to think that he looks like the person closest to me, the person on your left, as a commander. And that's the highest rank a foreign-born officer could achieve. And, you know, he's kind of thin, and I don't know, maybe he did look like that. That's as close as I can come. But moving up ahead, we get to one of the most important African Americans of the Civil War, and that was Robert Blake. And we don't have an actual picture of him. What we have is this picture was part of a poster that was sent out to the African American community asking African Americans to join the Navy. And it was this fellow who won, among the first, a Congressional Medal of Honor. He was the first to receive it. He wasn't the first to take action to get it. He was just the first to receive it. And guess what? He became a poster boy for the Union Navy. And it was very successful. And there were upwards of 20,000 Union sailors, as I mentioned to you, that were involved with the Navy. And some 200,000 that were in the Army. But the Navy was better. They treated each one of their sailors equally to the white. And if you want to see where he is memorialized, it's right here in Chester County. This is, of course, the Freedom Foundation with a statue of Abraham Lincoln. I took it in silhouette. If you go through the Medal of Honor Grove, you'll see it's divided up by state. In Virginia, you'll see the memory of our good friend Robert Blake, memorialized from Virginia, which is kind of interesting that we had so many Union, both soldiers and sailors from southern states. So now we get into what actually happened with my great-grandfather, John Alexander Johnston. Here was the problem. He found himself on the ship, the Cornubia. Get to that in just a second. Down in Galveston. And this is Galveston Harbor, and a picture of the blockade runner Denby. It was the most notorious blockade runner of the Civil War. It brought in more materials than any other blockade runner. And whoever was a commander of that, they had 2 or 3, but they all knew how to avoid the Union very, very well. Indeed, there must have been second thoughts that might have occurred to my great-grandfather. He would have been in very high demand, being an experienced shipper. He could have gone south, and he could have become a blockade runner, and he would have made a lot of money. It was a very valuable position. Nevertheless, this Denby was steaming into Galveston. This was in June of 1865, and it finally got cornered by 4 Union ships. One of them was USS Cornubia, and this is an image of the Cornubia. I couldn't find any photographs, but I did find this image. You can see our Confederate friends are watching with this thing as the Cornubia, which was built in England and was considered to be a very fast ship, was steaming into the harbor. What it does not show is how armed the Cornubia was. I actually found in an obscure book the rearming of the Cornubia, and its main battle rifle was a 30-pound Parrott rifle. 30-pounder is what they called it. And it was one hunker of a gun. And some of you have heard me tell this story. It's one of my favorites. I had no idea what a 30-pounder Parrott rifle was. So I call my neighbor, whose name is Ken. He lived right around the corner from us. He's moved out since then. And he knows everything about Civil War guns. And I said, what's a 30-pounder? Can I find a picture someplace? He said, so I got something even better than that. I have one right in my front yard. And sure enough, he had and still has in their lawn ornaments of these giant guns. And it looks like this. Well, we're going to get back to that in just a moment. Or there it is. There I am posing in front of a 30-pounder. It had a 2.4-inch gun is another name for the 30-pounders. 30-pounder is the weight of the shell. And it was 8.5 feet long and weighed 1.8 tons. And if they fired it at the maximum range, the flight time was about 30 seconds. So you can imagine firing a gun at a ship. The crew might see a flash of the gun and then hear the pop of the explosion. And then had to wait patiently for 10, 15 seconds before the shell actually arrived. And when it did arrive, it was huge. Nothing you would want to mess with. And so what was happening is that the Denby was sunk. My great-grandfather, the ship fired some shells. The Confederates had to beach the ship. Other Union sailors from other ships boarded the ship, set it on fire. It was a total wreck. And my great-grandfather was ordered to go take a station about a mile away. And we're going to go back to this ship. While he was anchored a mile off the Denby, he noticed as the sun was coming up on this particular morning, a schooner with a flag. And most importantly, the flag, of course, was Confederate. But most importantly, it was an armed schooner. And you can see, if you look close enough, you can see a large cannon on the front and some ancillary guns as well. And this schooner was a gunboat for Galveston Harbor. The reason the guns are important is that the Union ships would never fire on an unarmed ship. But when they noticed the guns, and it was 1 mile away, they turned their own guns, the Cornubia gun, the 30-pounder, towards that, fired 2 shots. And the crew aboard this boat, the LeCompte, abandoned ship. So my great-grandfather sent a crew, a boarding crew. They got on, they found a whole bunch of curious things, rifles that they took, and maps, and perhaps the most important thing they found was a Confederate flag, a battle flag of the Confederacy. And they brought that all back to my great-grandfather's ship. And that flag became the last battle flag to be captured by a Union force. Wow. Because we had our last surrender just a matter of a couple of weeks after this. And my great-grandfather saved that ship. And I found his logbook down at the Library of Congress, and I was looking at that the page where he captures all those things, and in giant letters he writes battle flag as one of the things that he captured from the ship. He gave it to his commanding officer, and I'm going to go right there. He gave it to his commanding officer, whose beard I just love. Can you imagine the regulations that allows that? And gave it to the Secretary. And I'm still looking for that flag. It must be in the Library of Congress someplace. And if any of you run across it, please let me know, because I want to see that battle flag. It could not have gotten anywhere. So Galveston played, of course, an important part of the final surrender, because it was so far south, so far away. And it took time for all the armies, including the final army to surrender, which was called the Trans-Mississippi Army. And they came to an agreement. This fellow managed to agree. This is Captain Benjamin Sands, and he came to an agreement with the generals of the Trans-Mississippi Army, surprisingly, not too surprisingly, but it was in New Orleans, not in Galveston. And then that would take effect just a couple of weeks after, they needed to let everybody know and come up with plans on how to disperse the army. It was a giant army with about at least 1/3 of the Confederate land. But this fellow, right here, Captain Sands, he needed to make an announcement that the war was going to be over. And he did so by going to the Customs House on June 5th. And he starts by pulling in his flagship, which was Cornubia, my great-grandfather's flagship. And the reason that was picked wasn't because he liked my great-grandfather, it was because it had a shallow draft and he didn't want to run aground. They go into the harbor of Galveston, and you can see that there's plenty of places where ships can park. It probably didn't have as much activity back in June of 1865 as it has right now, but they pulled up, and they managed to not anchor, but to tie the ship down at a pier. And then they went to this place, the Customs House. And there is a Customs House still in Galveston. My wife and I visited. There's a plaque that sort of talks about the final surrender. But what really happened was perhaps a little bit more interesting. Captain Sands had told the mayor of Galveston he was going to arrive on June 5th, and he would come armed only with pistols. That was going to be peaceful, no rifles. And you would have just a couple of other sailors with him, and he simply wanted to make an announcement. So the mayor calmed the population, said you can go and you can watch, but he doesn't want to hear any sound from any one of the residents. Captain Sands then thanked the mayor as he made his way to the Customs House. He made a speech there that all hostilities were now over. As of that day, June 5th, 1865, hostilities were over. Go back to your homes and simply consider yourself part of the Union. And he asked that the Confederate flag be lowered, which it was, and then he raised the Union flag, which still flies, well, the flag of the United States, as he called it, which still flies to this day at the Customs House. Well, of course, a couple of weeks after that, the Army shows up to, take occupation of Galveston. Navy is always a couple of weeks ahead of the Army anyway. So the Army shows up, and they make their own declarations. There's going to be peace, and every single person of color will no longer be considered to be enslaved. Rather, they will be an employee of whatever family they are working for. That was now the law of the land. It was that on June 19th, which gave us Juneteenth. And you can see here some ladies from the Melton Center celebrating Juneteenth when it was made a national holiday a couple of years ago. I took their picture. There's Juneteenth flag, as you can see, and celebrations happened that weekend, more or less around the 19th. From the African-American community, everyone is invited to celebrate peace in the land and freedom for everyone on here. But as you know, it wasn't free for everyone. Freedom, and Abraham Lincoln knew this really nationally, freedom was not at hand, and he wanted to see something happen. Abraham Lincoln had aged, as you can imagine, quite dramatically during his term, but he was absolutely bent on creating the law of the land that provided equity to everyone. And he began with what we now call the 13th Amendment, which simply put outlaws slavery. Because the South was already considering, well, we can use states' rights and still have slaves. They were coming up with all kinds of ways to circumvent the wishes of the North. And Abraham Lincoln, however, well, I'm going to read you what he was thinking at that time. After signing the Emancipation Proclamation, President Abraham Lincoln grew concerned that the executive order would not hold once the war was over. He made an executive order on January 1st, 1863. Radical Republicans in Congress who shared his concerns decided to take action. Representative James Mitchell Ashley of Ohio introduced a 13th Amendment to Congress on December 14th, 1863, which proposed ending slavery throughout the country. His Emancipation Proclamation only ended slavery for those slaves who were able to leave the South. Senator Charles Sumner suggested a more radical version of the amendment, arguing the words, "all persons are equal under the law." But the Senate rejected the change. On April 8th, 1864, the Senate passed 13th Amendment 38-6, but the House failed to pass it by the necessary 2/3 majority. To help its passage, President Lincoln endorsed the amendment before his reelection. Once reelected, Lincoln pressured the lame duck Congress to pass it. Are you getting the feeling there's some politics going on here?
Yeah.
He instructed Secretary of State William Seward and Representative Ashley to obtain the necessary votes. It remains unclear what Lincoln's role in these efforts were, although rumors persisted of backroom deals. Thaddeus Stevens later said, "The greatest measure of the 19th century was passed by corruption, aided and abetted by the purest man in America." That's American politics, right? On January 31st, 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, ending what many considered one of the worst stains on American history. That would be slavery, of course. One day later, while not needed for its passage, President Lincoln signed the amendment and simply wrote, "Approved." Today, the original document, you can see it at the National Archives. Thought I'd throw that in next time you're in DC. Look that up. So there were two other amendments because this did not cover everything. The 14th Amendment reversed Dred Scott. And what that basically means is what had happened is that all African Americans, all people of color, had their citizenship taken away. They became restored citizens. And it became, if you were born in America, you were automatically a citizen. 15th Amendment said that you couldn't deny the right to vote based on the race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Interesting choice of words there. And indeed, the southern states had tried their best to do everything they could to keep Black men from voting. Keep in mind, back in those days, only a man could vote. Women did not earn the right to vote until the early 1900s. But it was still an imperfect situation. And it was not until 1964 that Lyndon Johnson did the landmark Civil Rights and Labor Law of the United States that outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And I love this picture. Lyndon Johnson with Martin Luther King. They were able to celebrate together the final act of freedom for everyone in the United States. And only took them 100 years to get there. So that fulfills my presentation for today. Here's the Lincoln Room, another picture of it, just in case it's not clear. That will be one of your visiting places if you haven't been there. I am more than happy to provide tours, and you know my fee is $0, but I do Westchester tours. Minimum number of people is 1 and maximum number is 70. And yes, I have done downtown tours with 70 people and still have a voice.
Is that in Philadelphia?
No, that's in downtown Westchester, 28 West Market Street.
Okay.
If you can find the courthouse, you found the Lincoln Building. It's right across the street on Market Street.
Okay.
And I keep thinking, you know, because I'm there all the time, I forget that people don't, you know, always know where it is I'm talking about.
Okay.
So I apologize for that, but it is one of the great historic buildings of downtown Westchester.
Yeah.
And the Chester County Community Foundation, which is a private nonprofit, maintains the building and keeps it in the pristine historic nature that we have grown to love. I have written a book that talks about the first biography and the importance of the first biography of Abraham Lincoln. And that book that looks like this, if you were to make a $75 donation to the Chester County Community Foundation, you can receive a hardbound book like this. If, however, you simply want to read the story, I have brochures on the Lincoln Building, covers most of it, and those are all free. But I wrote a book about the abolition culture that led to the first writing of the first biography. And these books are $20. So none of that really makes a difference to me. What makes a difference is that I'm allowed to come and talk to each and all of you about the importance of this little corner of our history. And I so much appreciate your kind attention and would be delighted to open the floor to questions or comments.
Excellent presentation.
Oh, well, thank you.
Really educational.
Well, you're trying to think of a really good question. Doesn't matter if you come up with one, but I would ask you to please take one of these. This is the Community Foundation's annual report, and it's a user advised funds is what they do. And so those people who have projects that they really care about will create a user advised fund that will perpetually invest and support whatever projects that user dictates. So it's something to keep in mind. It's an easy way to create a perpetual legacy for any one of you or your families.
Can I make a brief commercial message for the Endowment Fund Board?
Yes.
A couple years ago, the Endowment Fund Board actually established a Westminster Fund at the Community Foundation. And we did that because the Presbyterian Church USA Foundation used to have a program where if a member of a Presbyterian church or anybody else, but mostly Presbyterians, wanted to do a gift, which is an income producing gift like a gift annuity, they could do it through the Presbyterian Church USA Foundation, then it would go to the church afterwards. Well, they stopped that program. And we had a couple of members who wanted to do that for Westminster, but we didn't have a way to do it. So we worked with Beth Harper Briley at the Community Foundation, and she helped us set up a Westminster fund. And we have a fund in there, and we actually have had a couple of members who've used it. So they are not just for people, but also for organizations like us. So thank you for letting me share.
Yeah, well, and thank you. We have a connection
We do.
with the church. That's wonderful.
Yep.
And there are about 425 other connections that we
Yep.
have throughout the county. And to learn more about how you or your organization can become involved with this, simply give them a call. And people like Beth,
And
very,
Jason now.
and now it's Jason, although Beth is still working
Very
in some
much,
of the
yeah.
corners.
Well,
Uh,
and the other thing is, I'm sorry to get distracted
Yeah,
from the
no, go
Civil
ahead.
War, but in our strategic plan, when the pillar that's working on homelessness is part of the group that established the fund for homelessness that has a goal of $1 million to endow so that they can address issues of underserved communities, people experiencing homelessness, blah, blah, blah. But Gary Liddick and Ruth Simonson have been particularly involved in setting that up. But that's another connection our church has with the work of the Community Foundation, giving people a way to leverage their gifts. I promise I'll stop now.
Oh, no, I could listen to that all day. I
Well, and
just
I could
love the
speak
work.
it all day. So you need to-
Excellent. That's excellent.
Yeah, I've been to the Lincoln Building. Abraham Lincoln was never there,
That's correct. Never set foot in Westchester.
but there are plenty of Lincoln artifacts there. You can read some extraordinary materials hanging on the walls.
9:30.
It's a wonderful place to go. And as a group, we want to tour there, we could. So just let us know if you're interested and we'll get something set up. It's
And I would be happy to customize such a tour and make it an enjoyable event.
Did you do the Juneteenth tours that started a couple years ago that started at the Historical Society? Were you involved with that one?
No, I did not. They are more than, they've worked so hard to do their own tours. And we're friends, of course, and I enjoy their tours. You know, fun for me to go out and do somebody else's tour. But no, the History Center, as they're referring to it now, it does a really outstanding job of the Juneteenth. And there are also ways that you can get involved with the Melton Center down on Market Street in Westchester, which is part of the old African American community. So, you know, there's so many ways that people can participate. You can do something different every year.
So do they talk about your great grandfather when they do the Juneteenth?
That part I don't know. It's never gotten back to me one way or the other. But there is, if you want to make a note of this, I did a blog. If you go to Cultural Alliance of Chester County, Google Cultural Alliance Chester County, and you'll go to our website, Cultural Alliance, and there's a blog page, and you can see the article where I quote from my great-grandfather exactly what took place with the ship that he sank, the LeCompte, and and I identify each one of his African-American sailors at the time. And I like to think that my great-grandfather and those sailors stood shoulder to shoulder on the ship, just a couple blocks away, when they saw the Stars and Stripes get raised above Custom House in Galveston, they cheered. And I'm sure that happened.
Any other questions, comments? Malcolm, thank you very much for the